Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 in Shadwell, a plantation in the colony of Virginia, into a family of landowners whose lives were closely tied to the rhythms of agriculture, tradition, and local community. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a self-made surveyor and planter of considerable reputation, a man of practical skill and determination, while his mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, belonged to one of the most established families in Virginia, bringing with her a legacy of status and refinement. This combination of practicality and heritage shaped the environment in which young Jefferson grew, offering him both the grounding of work and the exposure to ideas that reached beyond his immediate surroundings. From an early age, Jefferson exhibited a natural curiosity and a profound love for learning. Unlike many children of his age who might have been content with the simpler pastimes of plantation life, he immersed himself in books. His father maintained a modest library, and his relatives encouraged his thirst for knowledge. He learned Latin, Greek, and French, developing an early appreciation for the classics and the wisdom of antiquity. Music also held a strong place in his heart. He learned to play the violin and often found solace in harmonies that seemed to calm his mind and inspire reflection. Architecture fascinated him as well, and he began sketching simple designs, revealing a mind drawn to both structure and beauty. As he grew older, Jefferson's education expanded beyond the family estate. Tutors introduced him to mathematics, literature, and history, sharpening his intellect and preparing him for a more formal education. His father's death in 1757 left him with significant land and resources, but also a sense of responsibility. This loss marked a turning point in his youth, forcing him to confront both personal grief and the duties of inheritance. Yet rather than retreat into complacency, Jefferson embraced the opportunities before him, dedicating himself to study with even greater zeal. In 1760, he entered the College of William and Mary, one of the most prestigious institutions in the colonies. It was here that his intellectual world broadened dramatically. Surrounded by scholars and exposed to the works of Enlightenment thinkers, Jefferson discovered ideas that would shape his philosophy for the rest of his life. He read Locke, Bacon, and Newton, absorbing concepts of natural rights, empirical reasoning, and the pursuit of knowledge as a pathway to human improvement. The teachings of these philosophers resonated with his own developing sense that freedom and progress were not luxuries but essential conditions for human dignity. During his years at college, Jefferson also became acquainted with the workings of colonial law and government. Under the guidance of George Wythe, a distinguished legal mind, he began his study of law with a seriousness and rigor that distinguished him from many of his peers. Wythe's mentorship not only sharpened Jefferson's analytical skills, but also instilled in him a belief that the law could be a vehicle for justice rather than mere power. Jefferson spent long hours in Wythe's chambers, surrounded by books, learning not only the technicalities of legal codes, but also the moral foundations that underpinned them. His time in Williamsburg, the colonial capital, further immersed him in the political and cultural life of Virginia. The city was alive with debates, performances, and gatherings where the issues of the day were contested. Jefferson attended the governor's balls, mingled with influential figures, yet he remained reserved, preferring the company of books and a small circle of trusted friends. His shyness did not prevent him from observing keenly, and these observations contributed to his understanding of human character and the complexities of governance. It was during this period that Jefferson began to formulate the early outlines of his political thought. He saw firsthand the social inequalities of colonial society, where wealthy planters wielded power while others remained voiceless. At the same time, the Enlightenment ideals he absorbed suggested that societies could be built on principles of fairness and reason rather than hierarchy and tradition. This tension between the world he inherited and the world he imagined became the central struggle of his intellectual life. He questioned how a society could preserve liberty while maintaining order, and how individuals could flourish without undermining the stability of the community. Jefferson's early years were not solely devoted to intellectual pursuits. He was also shaped by the land itself, by the rolling hills and fertile soil of Virginia. He spent time surveying the terrain, riding horseback, and engaging in the physical tasks of plantation life. These experiences grounded him in the realities of agriculture and the dependence of society on the rhythms of nature. They also strengthened his conviction that the ideal citizen was one who lived close to the land, cultivating independence and virtue through honest labor. By the time Jefferson completed his formal studies, he had already developed a worldview that combined intellectual depth with practical awareness. He was neither entirely of the aristocracy nor fully detached from it. Instead, he stood at a crossroads, deeply aware of tradition, yet captivated by the possibility of change. His mastery of law prepared him for a career of service, while his love of philosophy and the arts ensured that his vision extended beyond the narrow confines of legal codes. In his youth, Jefferson had already begun to ask questions that would define his life. What was the proper role of government? How could liberty be preserved in a world prone to tyranny? What duties did individuals owe to one another in a community bound by law? These questions did not yet have definitive answers, but they revealed the direction of his thought and the strength of his character. He emerged from his early years with a mind sharpened with study, a spirit strengthened with responsibility, and a vision gradually taking shape. A vision in which freedom, knowledge, and harmony formed the cornerstones of a just society.
When Thomas Jefferson began his career as a lawyer in Virginia, he entered a profession that demanded precision, intellect, and the ability to persuade. His training under George Wythe had given him not only a strong grasp of the technical aspects of law, but also a moral foundation that emphasized justice and fairness. Almost immediately, he distinguished himself in court for his clarity of expression and his ability to craft arguments that were both logically rigorous and emotionally compelling. Clients recognized in him a man who could not only understand the complexities of their disputes, but also articulate their cause in a way that commanded respect. His practice grew steadily, and with it, his reputation as one of the most capable young lawyers in the colony. Yet Jefferson was never content with the mere mechanics of legal work. His mind constantly returned to questions of principle and philosophy. To him, law was not just a tool for resolving disputes, but a framework that shaped society itself. He spent long hours studying statutes, court precedents, and the works of philosophers whose ideas connected law to broader concepts of justice, liberty, and governance. This approach set him apart from many of his contemporaries, who often viewed the law in more practical terms. For Jefferson, every case was also a lesson in the responsibilities of power and the balance between individual rights and collective order. As Jefferson matured professionally, the political climate around him grew increasingly tense. The British Empire, burdened by the debts of global conflict, sought to extract more revenue from its American colonies. The imposition of taxes without colonial representation, the restrictions on trade, and the increasing presence of royal authority stirred resentment across the colonies. In Virginia, as elsewhere, planters, merchants, and ordinary farmers began to voice their frustrations. Jefferson, with his education steeped in Enlightenment ideals, recognized in these disputes a larger struggle over the nature of liberty itself. His writings during this time revealed a man deeply engaged with the pressing issues of his age. Jefferson took up the pen not merely as a lawyer, but as a thinker determined to clarify and defend the rights of his fellow colonists. His pamphlets and essays began to circulate among the literate public, articulating grievances against the crown with both precision and passion. He argued that laws imposed without representation violated the very principles of justice and natural rights that underpinned legitimate government. To many readers, his words provided not just criticism of British policies, but a vision of what government could and should be: fair, accountable, and rooted in the consent of the governed. In Williamsburg and other centers of colonial life, Jefferson's growing voice did not go unnoticed. His colleagues recognized his ability to blend legal reasoning with moral conviction, and his reputation as a thinker and advocate extended beyond the courtroom. He became involved in local committees that organized resistance to British measures, lending his skills to drafting resolutions and petitions that expressed the collective will of the colonists. Though not a fiery orator by nature, his influence was felt through his writings, which carried an authority that spoken words often could not achieve. As the conflict between Britain and its colonies intensified, Jefferson's sense of responsibility deepened. He saw that the grievances of the colonists were not isolated complaints, but symptoms of a broader pattern of imperial overreach. His study of history convinced him that unchecked power inevitably led to tyranny, and he believed that the American colonies stood at a crossroads where they had to decide whether to submit or to assert their rights. This conviction infused his legal and political work with urgency. Each pamphlet he wrote, each resolution he helped draft, became part of a larger movement that was slowly but unmistakably pushing the colonies toward a demand for independence. Jefferson's method of argument often combined practical examples with lofty ideals. He wrote of the burdens on farmers and merchants, the economic hardships imposed by taxes and trade restrictions. But he always linked these specifics to universal principles of justice. In doing so, he elevated local grievances into part of a larger human struggle for liberty. This ability to connect the immediate concerns of ordinary colonists with timeless philosophical ideas gave his writings a power that resonated widely. People who read his work not only understood their situation more clearly, but also felt that they were part of something greater, a cause that transcended their own hardships. His growing prominence, however, also required personal sacrifice. Jefferson was a man of scholarly habits who cherished solitude and the quiet of his estate. Yet the demands of political involvement increasingly pulled him into the public sphere. He balanced his professional duties as a lawyer with his responsibilities in the movement for colonial rights, often working late into the night to craft documents or respond to political developments. The intensity of these years tested his endurance, but it also refined his skills as both a legal mind and a political thinker. By the early 1770s, Jefferson had firmly established himself as more than a provincial lawyer. He had become a voice of principle, respected by peers for his intellect and valued by the broader colonial community for his ability to articulate their aspirations. Though still young, he was already seen as someone capable of leadership, not through fiery speeches, but through the steady force of reasoned argument and moral clarity. In these first steps of public service, Jefferson began the transformation from a private man of study to a public figure engaged in one of the most consequential struggles of his era. He was learning that words could move nations, that the pen could be as powerful as the sword, and that his own destiny was now inseparably bound to the fate of the colonies. What began as a career in law had expanded into a calling to serve his people, to defend their rights, and to help shape the course of history. What began as a career in law had expanded into a calling to serve his people, to defend their rights, and to help shape the course of history. What began as a career in law had expanded into a calling to serve his people, to defend their rights, and to help shape the course of history.
When Thomas Jefferson took his seat in the Second Continental Congress in 1776, he entered at a time when the colonies stood on the threshold of a decisive break with Britain. The first shots of the Revolution had already been fired at Lexington and Concord, and the colonies were no longer debating whether grievances could be redressed, but whether they should sever ties entirely. Within this charged atmosphere, Jefferson quickly emerged as a figure whose pen carried unusual weight. His colleagues recognized that his ability to distill complex ideas into clear and compelling language made him an ideal candidate for one of the most important tasks in American history.
The Congress decided that a formal Declaration of Independence was necessary, both to unify the colonies under a single cause and to explain to the world the reasons for their separation from the Crown. Jefferson was chosen to draft the document, not only for his literary talent, but also for his reputation as a man of principle who could express the spirit of the Revolution with clarity and dignity. At just 33 years of age, he shouldered the responsibility of speaking for an entire people and framing the ideals that would justify the birth of a new nation. Jefferson retreated to a quiet room in Philadelphia, where he worked with his usual discipline and intensity. Drawing upon his knowledge of English law, Enlightenment philosophy, and colonial grievances, he composed a draft that combined reasoned argument with moral conviction. He turned to John Locke's principles of natural rights and government by consent, but he gave them a uniquely American form. He wrote that all men were created equal, that they were endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were not abstract theories to him, but truths that explained why the colonies had the right to assert their independence. The document also laid out a detailed list of grievances against King George III, portraying him as a monarch who had violated the principles of just government. By cataloging these wrongs, Jefferson sought to demonstrate that independence was not a rash act of rebellion, but a necessary response to tyranny. He shaped his arguments carefully, knowing that they would be scrutinized not only by fellow colonists, but also by foreign powers whose support would be crucial to the survival of the new nation. When Jefferson presented his draft to the committee, it was reviewed and slightly revised by figures such as John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Though changes were made, the essence of the document, its soaring preamble, and its vision of equality and liberty remained Jefferson's. When it was brought before the full Congress, further edits were introduced, some of which Jefferson lamented, but the enduring voice of the Declaration was unmistakably his own. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. In that moment, Jefferson's words became the charter of a new nation. They captured not only the immediate necessity of separation, but also a universal ideal that would echo far beyond the circumstances of the Revolution. His assertion of equality and natural rights became the foundation upon which future generations would argue for justice, freedom, and human dignity. The reaction was profound. Across the colonies, the Declaration was read aloud in public squares, greeted with cheers and celebrations. For many, it was the first time they heard their cause expressed with such clarity and grandeur. Yet it also provoked anger and condemnation from loyalists and from Britain itself, where the document was seen as a treasonous manifesto. Jefferson, in writing it, had not only risked his reputation, but his life, for the signers of the Declaration knew they were marking themselves as enemies of the Crown. In the months that followed, Jefferson's role as the principal author of the Declaration established him as one of the intellectual leaders of the Revolution. His words traveled across the Atlantic, influencing debates in Europe about liberty and governance, and setting America apart as a nation founded not merely on rebellion, but on a set of articulated principles. The power of his vision lay in its simplicity and universality. Though the realities of American society fell short of the ideals he expressed, the Declaration created a standard against which the nation would be judged. For Jefferson personally, the creation of the Declaration marked the culmination of his early political journey. It showed the colonies that he was not only a skilled lawyer and legislator, but also a thinker whose grasp of philosophy could be translated into political action. The process tested his ability to balance lofty ideals with the demands of a diverse and pragmatic Congress. He emerged from it with a reputation that extended far beyond Virginia, becoming known as the philosopher of the Revolution. Though the Declaration did not end the war, it gave the struggle a moral and ideological framework that sustained it through years of hardship. Soldiers could fight not only for independence, but for the principles Jefferson had put into words. Citizens could endure sacrifice with the knowledge that they were part of a cause that aspired to universal truths.
Foreign powers reading the Declaration could see the revolution not as a provincial quarrel, but a struggle for human liberty with global significance. Thus, in 1776, Jefferson had inscribed his name into the story of America's creation. He had written words that would outlive him, words that generations would repeat in classrooms, courtrooms, and movements for justice. He had given the revolution its defining statement, and in doing so, he had become not just a participant in history, but one of its architects. The Declaration, with its call for equality and freedom, stood as a testament to the power of ideas to shape nations and inspire humanity. After the Declaration of Independence had been signed and the colonies had formally broken with Britain, Jefferson continued to dedicate his life to the service of the new republic. His reputation as a man of principle and as the author of one of the most influential political documents of the age made him an obvious choice for roles that required intellect, discretion, and vision. When he was appointed as a diplomat to represent the United States in France, he entered a new stage of his career that broadened his perspective beyond the immediate struggles of his homeland. In Paris, Jefferson immersed himself in the intellectual and cultural life of Europe. He observed firsthand the ferment of ideas that would soon erupt into the French Revolution. He visited salons where Enlightenment thinkers debated philosophy, politics, and economics, and he carefully studied the social and political inequalities that weighed heavily on French society. The grandeur of Versailles and the desperation of the Parisian streets existed side by side. And Jefferson, ever the keen observer, noted both the brilliance of French culture and the deep unrest that simmered beneath its surface. His role as a diplomat demanded skill in negotiation, tact in dealing with powerful monarchies, and the ability to represent a young and untested nation on the world stage. He sought to secure commercial treaties that would strengthen America's economy and to establish the legitimacy of the United States among European powers. While he admired much of what he saw in French art, science, and architecture, he remained focused on the larger mission of ensuring that his country could stand independently, free from the domination of older empires. The events unfolding in France left a profound impression on him. He sympathized with the aspirations of the French people, who, like the Americans, sought liberty and relief from oppressive rule. The echoes of the American Revolution could be heard in Paris, and Jefferson felt a sense of solidarity with those who raised the cry for freedom. At the same time, he saw the dangers of excess and the volatility of radical change, lessons that would later influence his thinking about the balance between liberty and order. When Jefferson returned to the United States, he brought with him both new experiences and renewed convictions. He was soon appointed Secretary of State under President George Washington, placing him at the center of the young nation's political life. In this role, he became one of the principal architects of American foreign policy, emphasizing the need for independence from European entanglements, while also advocating for commercial openness that would allow the nation to grow. Yet his service was not limited to foreign affairs. Within Washington's cabinet, Jefferson clashed repeatedly with Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. Their disagreements were not merely personal, but reflected two distinct visions for the Republic. Hamilton favored a strong central government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain, seeing these measures as essential to building a modern and powerful state. Jefferson, by contrast, believed in limited central authority, the primacy of state governments, and an agrarian society built on the independence of farmers. To him, the strength of the Republic lay not in concentrated power or financial institutions, but in the civic virtue of its citizens and the preservation of their liberties. This conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton gave rise to the first party system in the United States. Jefferson's supporters coalesced into what would become the Democratic Republican Party, advocating for states' rights and suspicion of centralized power, while Hamilton's followers formed the Federalist Party, favoring a more robust national government. Although Washington himself sought to remain above faction, the divisions within his cabinet revealed the inevitable emergence of political parties, a development that Jefferson both contributed to and struggled with.
As Secretary of State, Jefferson also dealt with the challenge of maintaining neutrality in a world still dominated by European empires. Britain and France remained locked in conflict and, though sympathetic to France, understood the necessity of avoiding entanglement that could endanger the fragile republic. His efforts to balance principle with pragmatism demonstrated the difficulty of steering a new nation through the turbulent waters of international politics. Despite the controversies of his tenure, Jefferson's time as diplomat and statesman helped shape the foundations of American political life. His experiences in France deepened his commitment to liberty, while his battles with Hamilton clarified his belief in decentralization and the rights of states. The tensions he embodied between idealism and pragmatism, liberty and order, centralization and local autonomy would continue to define the American experiment for generations. Through these years, Jefferson matured as both a thinker and a leader. He proved that his talents extended beyond the crafting of stirring documents to the practical work of governance and diplomacy. His influence was felt not only in the policies he helped shape, but also in the broader philosophical direction he gave to the Republic. He stood as a reminder that the ideals proclaimed in 1776 required constant defense and careful application, both at home and abroad.
When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, he entered office as the third leader of the young United States and the first to represent a peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties. This transition was itself a landmark moment, demonstrating that the Republic could withstand partisan divisions without collapsing into turmoil. Jefferson approached the presidency with humility and a determination to scale back what he saw as the excesses of government power. He envisioned a nation rooted in republican simplicity, where authority was restrained and citizens retained broad liberties. His inauguration set the tone for his administration, emphasizing reconciliation and the belief that the government must serve the people rather than dominate them. Jefferson quickly moved to implement reforms that reflected his philosophy. He sought to reduce the national debt, streamline government operations, and eliminate unnecessary offices and expenses. He cut military expenditures, favoring a smaller standing army in order to minimize the risks of militarism and centralization. For Jefferson, the preservation of the Republic depended on the cultivation of civic virtue among independent farmers, rather than the accumulation of power in a distant capital. He presented himself as a citizen leader, avoiding pomp and ceremony and striving to bridge the gap between the government and the people. The defining moment of Jefferson's presidency came with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. When Napoleon Bonaparte offered to sell a vast expanse of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, Jefferson seized the opportunity, despite his own doubts about the constitutional authority of the federal government to acquire new territory. By doubling the size of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase secured control of the Mississippi River and opened immense tracts of land for settlement. Jefferson regarded the acquisition as essential to his vision of an agrarian republic, where generations of farmers could find independence on their own land. The decision, though controversial, transformed the nation and remains one of his greatest achievements. To better understand the vast new territory, Jefferson authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition, which set out to explore the western lands, map rivers and mountains, and establish contact with Native American tribes. The expedition not only expanded geographic knowledge, but also symbolized the spirit of exploration and growth that defined the early republic. Jefferson followed its progress closely, fascinated by the discoveries and eager to integrate the new lands into the nation's future. Yet Jefferson's presidency was not free from challenges. On the international stage, the United States found itself caught between European powers engaged in nearly constant war. Britain and France both imposed restrictions on American trade, seizing ships and impressing sailors. Jefferson, determined to avoid war, attempted to use economic pressure rather than military force. The Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited American ships from trading with foreign nations, was intended to compel respect for American neutrality.
Instead, it devastated the American economy, especially for merchants and coastal communities, and fueled widespread resentment. Critics accused Jefferson of undermining the very liberties he had once defended, and the embargo became one of the most unpopular measures of his presidency. Domestic politics also tested Jefferson's leadership. His vision of a decentralized agrarian republic clashed with the realities of governing a growing and diverse nation. While he sought to unite Americans under the ideals of Republican virtue, partisan conflicts persisted, and the opposition Federalist Party accused him of hypocrisy and weakness. Debates over the scope of federal power, the role of the judiciary, and the balance between national and state authority continued to divide the political landscape. Jefferson himself wrestled with contradictions, particularly in reconciling his advocacy for liberty with his continued ownership of enslaved laborers. These tensions shadowed his presidency and complicated his legacy. Despite these difficulties, Jefferson's time in office solidified the independence of the United States and expanded its horizons. He demonstrated that the presidency could be both powerful and restrained, guided by principles even when challenged by practical realities. His policies fostered westward expansion, encouraged a sense of national identity, and reinforced the idea that the United States was destined to grow into a continental power. The Louisiana Purchase, in particular, stood as proof of his ability to seize opportunities that would shape the nation's destiny. By the time Jefferson left office in 1809, he had left an indelible mark on the presidency and the republic. His administration embodied both the promise and the contradictions of American democracy. He had strengthened the foundations of self-government while also exposing the difficulties of applying abstract ideals to the complexities of real-world governance. His presidency remained a mixture of triumphs and controversies, of achievements that expanded the nation's possibilities and policies that tested its unity. In the years that followed, observers would look back on Jefferson's presidency as a crucial period in the development of the United States. It was a time when the boundaries of the nation expanded, when Republican ideals were tested against political and economic challenges, and when the vision of a free and independent republic was both advanced and questioned. Jefferson, with his intellect, pragmatism, and contradictions, had guided the country through a formative chapter, leaving future generations to grapple with the legacy of his choices.
After leaving the presidency in 1809, Thomas Jefferson withdrew to Monticello, his estate in the hills of Virginia. For him, retirement did not mean idleness, but rather a redirection of energy from the struggles of public office to pursuits of philosophy, science, agriculture, and education. He carried with him the weight of decades of service and the contradictions that had defined his career. Monticello became both a sanctuary and a laboratory, where Jefferson attempted to live out his ideals of simplicity, learning, and civic responsibility. Surrounded by books, inventions, and visitors who sought his counsel, he transformed his home into a reflection of his restless intellect. Among Jefferson's greatest undertakings in retirement was the creation of the University of Virginia. He regarded education as the surest safeguard of liberty, believing that an informed citizenry was essential to the survival of a republic. Dissatisfied with existing institutions, he envisioned a university that would be free from sectarian influence and dedicated to the advancement of knowledge across disciplines. He designed its buildings, planned its curriculum, and labored over its organization with the same intensity he had once devoted to statecraft. The university was his attempt to give the nation a lasting gift, a place where future generations could cultivate reason, virtue, and independence of mind. For Jefferson, this endeavor represented the culmination of his lifelong belief in the power of ideas to shape society. Yet the serenity of Monticello was shadowed by personal struggles. Jefferson faced mounting financial difficulties, the result of long-standing debts, declining plantation revenues, and his own generosity. He often extended credit to friends and family, only to find himself unable to meet obligations as economic conditions worsened. These burdens forced him to sell personal possessions and land, a painful irony for a man who had once guided the nation through unprecedented expansion. The contradictions of his life, including his reliance on enslaved labor to sustain Monticello, became increasingly stark in his later years. He lived with the tension between the ideals he had proclaimed and the realities that underpinned his livelihood. Despite these hardships, Jefferson remained a figure of immense respect. His correspondence with John Adams became one of the most remarkable exchanges in American history. Once bitter political rivals, the two men found common ground in old age, sharing reflections on philosophy, government, and human nature. Their letters revealed both the wisdom of experience and the humility of men who had seen their youthful ambitions tested by history. This reconciliation served as a powerful symbol for the Republic, reminding Americans that unity and dialogue were possible even after fierce divisions. The Adams-Jefferson correspondence provided a window into the intellectual currents of the age and affirmed the enduring friendship of two architects of independence. In his final years, Jefferson lived more quietly, though his home remained a destination for visitors from across the nation and beyond. Statesmen, students, and curious travelers came to Monticello to see the man whose words had helped launch a revolution. He welcomed them with warmth and engaged them in discussions that ranged from agriculture to philosophy. Even in frailty, his mind remained active, his curiosity unquenched. He took solace in the belief that he had contributed to the advancement of liberty, even as he acknowledged the imperfections of both his life and the young nation he had helped to shape. Jefferson's death came on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The coincidence of the date seemed to seal his life with a sense of destiny, linking his final breath to the founding moment he had helped define. On that same day, John Adams also passed away, leaving the nation to reflect on the intertwined legacies of two men who had shaped its course. Jefferson's passing was mourned across the country, and his memory was celebrated as that of a thinker, a statesman, and a visionary whose ideas had given voice to a people's aspirations. His legacy was complex, a blend of triumph and contradiction. He had articulated the principles of equality and liberty, yet had lived as a slaveholder. He had championed limited government and local authority, yet had exercised bold executive power in acquiring new lands. He had sought harmony, but presided over periods of fierce division. In these contradictions lay the reflection of the Republic itself, a nation struggling to reconcile ideals with reality. Jefferson's life offered both inspiration and challenge, urging future generations to continue the work of perfecting the promises of independence. Jefferson's enduring influence was most visible in the institutions he helped shape and the words he left behind. The Declaration of Independence continued to inspire movements for freedom around the world. The University of Virginia stood as a monument to his faith in education. Monticello, with its blend of classical design and American innovation, embodied his vision of a life guided by reason and beauty. His legacy lived not only in monuments and texts, but in the very fabric of American identity, woven into the ideals that citizens continue to debate and strive toward. In the twilight of his life and in the memory of his death, Jefferson remained a figure both revered and scrutinized. He was celebrated as a founder of liberty and questioned for the limitations of his practice. Yet his contributions to the intellectual and political foundations of the United States were undeniable. He had shaped the course of a nation and left behind a legacy that demanded reflection, critique, and renewal. In this way, his life did not end in silence, but continued to resonate through the generations that followed.